Welcome, everybody. We're going to start the presentation of the report soonish, and we are going to start by Ruth doing the general welcoming.
So, hello, yes, and welcome everyone to today's launch of the Extraction Fashion Report. This is a report produced by One and Research and Degrowth International. My name is Ruth Ozier, and I work at One. So the background to this report is that the fashion industry's environmental footprint, it's widely discussed. Lots of stats, lots of figures. But in actual fact, its global patterns remain deeply under-examined. That is why this report, Extraction Fashion, is an important new report because it has credible data, not only on the scale, but also on the origins of the land, the water, minerals, fossil fuels, human labour that go into producing fashion, specifically for the EU and UK, and specifically in a single year of 2021. This new footprint analysis reveals fashion's extractive model, two important things: how it is pushing the planet beyond its climate and ecological limits, while simultaneously also depriving many global south producing countries of the earth goods or natural resources, the land, the energy, the human labour that's essential for their own economic development. Degrowth can be a problematic term for some, and at One we know that, we're aware of it, but it's also why this collaboration on this report with Research and Degrowth International was important for us, because we do believe that a proper understanding of those core principles of degrowth and understanding fashion as an industry that is actually extracting wealth from the global south, from producing countries, that offers new ways of connecting struggles and connecting solutions that go across labour, economic, climate and ecological justice struggles. So I am going to very briefly introduce each of the speakers. We're not going to speak for long. It's just so that you get a good sense of the flavour of this report. So first, we're going to hear from Morena Hambre-Lemos, who did the amazing job of doing the data analysis for this report. She is a PhD researcher in ecological economics at the Institute of Environmental Science and Technology, part of the Autonomous University of Barcelona. So Morena is going to explain the methodology behind this new data and why it's important for understanding fashion. We'll then hear from Tansy Hoskins. Tansy is an award-winning author and journalist, and she writes extensively about the global fashion industry. Tansy actually wrote this report with One, and so she is going to pick up on some of the key findings from the report. And then you will hear from me again for a little bit in terms of how we would like and hope that this report will help shape debates on changing the fashion industry and just transitions. So I'll now hand back over to Lorenzo, if maybe you can then introduce yourself and Research and Degrowth International. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you very much. It's really nice to see all these people here and to have collaborated together to elaborate this report and also to co-organize this event. As you said, my name is Lorenzo Nardi. I work here at Research and Degrowth. I have a team. We have a team of editorial policy brief. And here in the Research and Degrowth, we work on training, advocacy, education, and research on degrowth. And as you said, Ruth, sometimes degrowth can be a scary word, but we don't see it in that way. For us, degrowth something different. Degrowth simply in really short terms. We don't believe that perpetual economic growth can be sustainable for the people and for the planet. We cannot grow forever if we have a single planet and if we extrapolate resources each year more. So here at Research and Degrowth, we try to understand how we can do that without growing, how we can live well without growing perpetually. And we do it through advocacy, through education, and through research. And one of the things that we did here is doing this research with Warren Want, elaborating this report. And from this report that we started to do some years ago, we, at the beginning, Warren Want and R&D, we wanted to develop together a policy brief, but then we decided to concentrate more on the data, on all the data of the extrapolation of the global south. So in the end, we decided to just do a report. And then after R&D alone, we elaborated a policy brief that in the end, I'm gonna briefly explain on how we can tackle this problem in this sector. I will explain it because today, unfortunately, the author, Marula Zakari, is not here. She had an emergency, a personal emergency. So I will broadly explain a bit the policy brief. Please, if you have any question, you can scan the QR code here, or you can join at menti.com and insert this number. It's going to be already present in all the slides. Meanwhile, I'm going to pass it to Morena. I will just...
Thanks a lot, Lorenzo and Ruth, for the introduction. I'm going to quickly share my screen. Let's see. Okay, I hope you can see my slides. Yes, that's great. Okay, so as Lorenzo said, I am Morena. I worked with providing the data, so doing the data collection and the data analysis for this report. That also informed the policy brief that was produced afterwards. So I'm going to quickly go through the methodology that we use to produce the data and why we decided to focus on this and on the question of unequal exchange. So very quickly, unequal exchange is based on an idea that peripheral countries, so countries of the global south or developing countries, they work with the extraction of raw materials and also supplying cheap labor to countries of the core or global north or developed countries. So that means that core countries, they import these raw materials, they do all the final processing and the branding. And by doing that, they capture most of the profit that happens throughout the supply chain. And this means that the environmental and the social impacts of this production stays in the global south, while the profit stays in the global north. That's why we say that it's an unequal exchange. So what this means is that countries in the imperial core or developed countries, they move the process of generating economic value to the periphery. So the actual production of value happens in the peripheral countries, and the consumption of the final products and the capture of the profits happens in the developed countries.
Morena, sorry to interrupt you. Could you enlarge a bit the slides a little bit if you can?
Oh, which one do you see? Do you not see the
Perfect. That's great.
Okay, that's better. Okay, great. Oh, great. So where was I? Here. So this means that the extraction, the process of extraction, the input of labor, and all the environmental and social degradation that comes with this process, they do not happen in the north where the consumption of the products happen. They happen in other places and in peripheral places that are more vulnerable to this. So while the north gets the value that is produced throughout the supply chain and the production, the south does the work and bears the cost of that production. And it also doesn't necessarily get to consume these products. So this is just a bit of a background on unequal exchange and why we want to look at this. And then now I want to show you what we are measuring with this methodology. So this is kind of a very simplified version of a supply chain. and so that you can understand exactly what goes into this calculation. So when we are measuring embodied resources, we are not looking at what is directly traded. And this is why this methodology is so useful and important, because it can look through everything that is being traded indirectly within the supply chain. So I'm not looking only at, for example, country A selling cotton to country B, but I'm looking at the whole production supply chain to see all the exchanges. And I'm assigning the use of these resources to the final country, so the country that consumes this product. So just as an example, let's go through the supply chain that I have on the screen. We have, for example, country A that is providing the supply chain with, let's say, cotton. But obviously, cotton doesn't mean only the cotton itself. It also means that there is land that goes into the production of this cotton. It means that there is water, there are fertilizers, there is labor, and all of that is embodied in the production of cotton. And then there is country B that is providing the supply chain with, let's say, cows. Again, it's not only the cow itself, but everything that goes into the existence of the cow, the land where the cow lives in, the corn that goes into feeding the cow, or the soy that goes into feeding the cow, the water, and so on. So country A sells the cotton to country C, and country C uses that cotton to produce cloths, to produce the cloth material, the cotton cloths. And again, it's not only the cloth itself, but the labor, the water, the machinery, everything that goes into taking something from cotton and producing it into a piece of cloth. Where in country D, we have the process of having the cow skin, let's say, and producing that into a piece of leather. Country C and country D then sell the piece of cloth or the piece of leather to country E, that then transform that into garments. So we think about all the labor that goes into that production. And then country F receives all of that and does the branding and the marketing, for example. This is something that is not unknown to any of you, this process. And you can imagine, just by looking at the screen, you can imagine where, in which country each of these processes happen, because it's kind of intuitive to us at this point, right? So we know that country F is most likely a powerful country of the global north that is then reaping the benefit of all the resources and all the labor that went into this production throughout the supply chain in many different countries, and is then selling it for a lot of money in comparison to the money that it paid for all these different inputs. So in order to do this measurement, we use a methodology called environmentally extended input-output analysis. And I have a simplified version here on the screen. I'm not going to go into too much detail, not to scare you all. But basically, input-output analysis lets us map and quantify this flow of resources. So exactly the flow that I showed you before of the cotton and the land and the water moving through the supply chain and arriving at the final consumer. Input-output analysis lets us follow this input all the way to the final consumer, which is what we do here with this report. So here we have the different matrices that we use to do the calculations of input-output. And what is important here, or everything is important, but what we use when we are doing these calculations is the Z matrix, so the one that you see in pink and red, and the Y matrix. These are the most important for us because the Z matrix has the inter-industry information. So you see something coming from region E and arriving at region B or region C, but also from an industry in region E and then going into another industry, an industry in region B and then going to another industry in region A. So these are all the different inter-industry exchanges that are captured in this methodology. And Y here is a final demand. So what we do in this report is we are looking at, for example, the final demand of the UK, because we want to see which of these exchanges were caused by the consumption of the UK. So we look at the UK here in the Y matrix. And to do that, we use ExioBase, which is a very well-known and very complete and detailed input-output table. We use the newest version of ExioBase, which is version 3.9. As you can see here, there is a short description of what Excitobase is. And basically, Excitobase can be used for this analysis of the environmental impacts that are associated with the final consumption of a product, which is exactly what we're doing here, focusing in the final consumption of products that are related to the fashion industry. So I will stop here. Let me stop sharing my screen. There you go. And yeah, if you have any questions regarding the methodology, you can put them in the Mentimeter, and I'm happy to answer.
Thank you, Miranda. That's really helpful, very, very good and clear explanation of the data. And I'm going to pass to Tansy just shortly, just to take us through what some of that data analysis revealed in some key areas. I did want to just say that the report that you'll see, Miranda first looked at 3 years, and then we focused on 2021. So there was a process of looking at this for 3 years and then looking at 2021 itself, because we felt 2021 represented, there was some consistent patterns. The approach was also to look at where's the majority of this coming from for the final consumption in the UK or the EU. And then some of the tables that you'll see, and Tansy will talk through, that's, you know, basically looking at where's that top 90% coming from. And we also provide total figures. So I will hand over to you, Tansy, just to talk through what some of that data came through and struck you from the report.
Yes, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you so much to Ruth and War on Want for this opportunity, and thank you to Research and Degrowth, and especially Mirena for doing the incredibly complicated work of figuring out all this data. Like, I got to do the fun bit, which was you know, just go through the data and let my sort of mind be blown by some of the things that we discovered here. And I can see from the people here, there's a lot of people who've been working in the fashion industry and researching fashion and campaigning on fashion for a very long time, and all of you will know how much of a hot potato data in the fashion industry has become. And this was really why we wanted to do this report, is to give people some concrete data that can be relied upon. So if I just quickly pull out some of the most striking parts of this report, I'd like to start with the question of land, because for me, land shows the earth-shaking insanity of the fashion industry as it is today. So in a single year, and yes, the year we picked was 2021, the fashion industry used a land mass the size of Great Britain just to produce fashion for the EU 27. And we also looked at Great Britain and the fashion footprint for Great Britain. And in the same year, Britain stole a landmass roughly the size of Belgium in order to produce the clothes that people here are wearing. So if we think about what does this data, you know, what does something like that tell us, that, you know, a landmass the size of Great Britain and a landmass the size of Belgium? Well, first of all, it shows us that fashion is using up country-sized tracts of land, which could otherwise have grown food, provided houses, parks. It could have been reforested or rewilded. And this question of land and land use shows how the overproduction of fashion for corporate interests has tilted the world away from food and freedom and us asking, what do we need? And now everything is being channeled into, what do corporations and capitalism want? The second thing that this data shows us is it completely explodes the myth of fashion as a commodity that is being made by New York, Paris, London, and Milan. You know, that's the myth that we're told about the fashion industry, is that it's produced by these 4 major places. But the reality is, when we dig deeper into the data, is that the majority of this land extraction took place on the continent of Africa, followed by the continent of Asia, specifically China. So what we can see is that the clothes being produced for consumption in the EU are not being made using the wealth of Europe, but are based upon this system of land extraction from the global south. Because of course, cotton cannot be grown on the Champs-Elysees, cotton cannot be grown on Oxford Street. Instead, what we are seeing is that there would be no fashion without Africa, which is, a major hidden truth, and Africa as a continent is just not given the credit that it deserves. And number three, the third thing I think this shows us is that this is proof of the way that an extractive system shows us that really the decolonization of the planet that we so desperately need is expressly tied to the return and the redistribution of stolen land. And by that I mean both land that has been explicitly stolen and land that we're seeing in this report that continues to be appropriated and stolen through extraction. And this decolonization, this return and redistribution of land, really is the start of a fair and just world. The second thing I want to very quickly highlight is fossil fuels, because that's obviously such a hot topic at the moment. And this is another existential earth source that fashion would just love to kick under the carpet. And we know, everybody in this room knows, that the fact is that burning coal, oil, and gas is causing the climate crisis. And now I'm just really happy that for the first time we can see concrete data for how much fossil fuels the fashion industry is using. And again, it's mind-boggling. 2021, a total of 40,976 kilotons of fossil fuels went into fashion for EU consumption. And here on this island of the UK, 6,625 kilotons of fossil fuels was used to create clothing for the UK. And, there is oil and gas in the UK, but only 2.3% came from within the UK. When we look at the geography of fashion that this data shows us, these are fossil fuels coming from China, from Russia, and across Asia. And, to just think about the fact that knowledge is power. And really, if you are working at the intersection of fashion and climate, then I think all of us hope that you will please use this new information to inform your work and your communities, because ultimately fashion and fossil fuels in fashion presents us with a stark existential question. Should we allow the rich to destroy the planet with shoes and clothes as the payoff? That's the point that we are at. And then just finally, I would like to talk about labor. So I'd like to talk about the aspect of fashion production that the fashion industry would most like to hide behind its glittering facade. And this is the set of statistics that I think has really stayed with me the most and has really shows beyond any shadow of a doubt the extraction and the value that the fashion industry is sucking out of the world. So, what if I told you that in 2021 alone, the fashion industry took over 5 million years of human time to create the fashion that was imported into the EU. And just to emphasize, I am not talking about hours. I'm not talking about 5 million hours, which would be obscene enough. I am talking about over 5 million years. And it's important to add very quickly that this data in this report is about formal employment, because the informal labor data, and as well as I do that fashion runs on informal data, the work of home workers and informal laborers in agriculture, that data is still not good enough for us to use. So what we're talking about here is formal labor. And again, what does this tell us? Over 5 million years of existence is being siphoned off in 1 year to produce fashion for the EU. And in return, all people are getting is poverty wages, because remember, not a single major fashion brand pays a living wage in their supply chains. Number two, the second thing this tells us is that this is incredibly unfair. Every hour spent in a factory in China or Turkey or India is an hour that those people are not able to use for family, for care work, for practicing agroecology, for building flood defenses, for protecting and restoring habitats, for education, health, community building, political engagement, as well as what every garment worker on the planet would love to have more of, rest and leisure. That's what's being denied to people. Number 3, again, this explodes the myth that fashion is a thing done by New York, London, Paris, and Milan. The top 3 sources of human labor for producing fashion consumed in the EU and the UK are China, India, and what is categorized as the rest of Asia. So, of course, countries like Bangladesh, Cambodia, Myanmar, and so on. And this brings us to point number 4, and I'll finish on this point, Ruth, which is that that is a lot of hours. So just to stress, that is an incredible number of hours and an incredible number of people. There's approximately 72 million people working in the global garment industry. And so the question that should be forefront of all of our minds and all of our work is, what about the jobs? This is a lot of people. This is an existential question for much of the global south. And of course, we don't need to imagine what might happen if the factories all just disappeared. We saw it happen in COVID. The factories shut down. It was a disaster. People starved. People had to sell their possessions, take their children out of school. It was awful, which absolutely emphasizes the need for a transition to be a just worker-led transition. And I want to quote from a friend of mine who many of you know, Kalpana Akhtar, who's a labor rights activist in Bangladesh. And she says, "We workers did not screw this up. It's you people who wanted to have more clothes at less prices and who put us in a difficult situation with poverty wages and long hours. And now you think you need to do something that will make a green economy, but you're not going to think about us." And then she says, "No, we want our space at the table to make sure we're not losing anything. Until then, don't talk to us about green economies." And if you know Kalpana, you'll know how strident she is about protecting workers' rights. And of course, she's absolutely right. So the last thing I want to emphasize as part of point 4, what about the jobs, is that there is some good news within this data. And I truly believe that if we use our clothes as a lens here, and we use the fashion industry and this data as a lens, that we can start to see the possibilities of what could happen if the global south stops servicing the global north. Because what this data shows us is that the labor and the production of the world economy across the fashion industry, but of course across all skill levels in all sectors, is being overwhelmingly performed in the global south, whilst the yields are being disproportionately captured by the global north. So the question for all of us that I'd like to pose for you and leave you with is, what if this changed? What if every country or community in the global south could ask, what do we need? What do we want to be producing? What are we producing too much of? And what are we not producing enough of? And if we think about within a single year, if it wasn't fashion that was being made, there would be those 5 million years of time that people would get to spend building a better world. I think that's the that's the ultimate point that this data shows us, is that in amidst the despair and the difficulties around the climate crisis and the workers' rights crisis, there is real possibility here. So I'm extremely grateful to War on Want and to Research and Development for bringing this to light, and I hope that everybody will run with this data, make it fly, take it back to your communities and use it in your work. So thank you.
That's great, thank you, Tansy. And yes, it is a really good lead through to what I want to come on to next. And in fact, could I ask if we go to the next slide, because I've decided to just change over how I approach it. So yeah, following on from what Tansy is saying, it does lead to the question. So what will happen if this drastically shrinks? And as Tanzia said, that if the UK and corporate fashion companies just started producing less, that doesn't represent a just transition. It just results in fairly immediate hardship, both for workers and for the countries that have become so linked and dependent on the export of fashion and garments. So why don't garment producing countries put this wealth, the resources, the human labour into other forms of social and economic uses, for alternative domestic development? This is where I really hope that this report helps, because what we wanted to show is that the EU and UK fashion corporations, the overproduction and the ability to produce these mountains of clothing is not by chance. It's because of what we like to talk about as a rigged global economy. And underpinning that economy, it's the unfair and unequal tax and trade rules that have resulted in global South countries in this relationship, in this model of where they're dependent on low value added, export-led trading models, fashion being one key example of that. And international loans that generate debt that then perpetuate the cycle of needing to do more of this low value added export model. And also we're seeing that many of the same garment producing countries across Asia, for example, recently with the floods, the cyclone and floods in Asia, they're now incurring more debt in order to manage to respond to climate and ecological breakdown that they're not historically most responsible for. So thinking about a just, equitable and ecological transition along degrowth lines, this report argues that you need to think around removing the barriers that are currently there for countries that are dependent on this low value added fashion export as an economic lifeline, so that there are opportunities for genuinely sovereign decisions about their own economic development strategies and priorities. That means that all of those people in producing cotton, in factories, in distribution, those are the ones that should be at the centre of what a transition protects and provides alternatives for, because that's the key thing, is the alternatives. As we've heard, degrowth is not about reducing all forms of production everywhere, but it's reducing that less necessary forms of production, and it is targeted at richer global North countries. But it's not just around the reducing. It's about the redistribution of produce and resources. So this unequal exchange lens that Morena so really excellently provided, that is what we need to sort of think about. What is driving this, and what is stopping alternatives? So in the report, we want to pick up on what this trinity, it's the tax, the trade, and the debt. So for example, a UN tax convention is a starting place. It's around changing some of the trade rules and regimes. It is around cancelling debt, which plays such a massive role in garment producing countries and perpetuating that industry. And it is also measures to prevent that debt just simply reaccumulating again. These are all deeply relevant to degrowing fashion, because these challenge the reasons that overproduction and that profit accumulation outside of those countries is taking place. So I hope that sort of shows that it's these are some of the threads, and for real extensive deep structural change, we have fashion, and changing fashion is as much around the tax, the debt, and the trade as it is addressing some of the sort of immediate policy pathways as well. So I think that's, me trying to say that from War on Want's point of view, if you want to maybe just jump back to that previous slide, if that's okay. We have what we kind of call these 4 principles that are principles and tests around how change out of crisis can be navigated. And you'll see here that it's around all of these 4 principles together. It's not just one, or it's not just 3. In the 4th one is where our report sits, around looking at changing the underlying principles that are at the heart of our economies. So thank you. If you want to shift back to the previous slide, thank you. So this is just a very brief attempt to show what fashion, this data tells us about fashion. And then in answer to the question, what about the jobs? The challenge is, how can labour and natural goods be organised around socially necessary production to meet local needs? And for every region, country and community, there will be some different answers to that. But it is around addressing ultimately that economic architecture that is inhibiting and are barriers to that change. So I might leave my presentation there. I'm sure there may well be some questions. I'll hand back to you, Lorenzo.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Thank you very much, Morena and Tansi. Amazing work on this report. Yes, after we developed this report together with Warren Want, Research and Degrowth decided to give a tangible answer. How could it work? How degrowth policy could look like in this sector? As I told before, today the author is not here to present it for an emergency, unfortunately. So I will try to briefly present what we did here, but I'm not going to go too into depth. Also, the policy brief and the report are now online on our website. If you want to get into that, you can read our full policy brief or the executive summary. If you don't have time, we just really briefly explain what our proposals, and also you can find the full report that we made on with Warren Want. So what we saw from this report simply is that this sector cannot grow forever. It's a growth-centric sector. It bases its models on growing each year more to produce something that sometimes it's unnecessary. So the general idea of this policy brief is that we have to go away from what this report is showing. So we have to go away from an extractivist and colonial logic that the fashion industry embodies. So the general idea here in the policy brief is that we need to diversify fashion. We need to start to localize it more and make it sustainable and based care, no? And in our policy brief, we divided in three areas. So we want to degrow the fashion industry, starting from production. And if you read it, you're gonna see that we are talking about share system, library of clothes, putting cap on garments, on how on creating a sector that it's more localized and it's more based on sharing, but especially on repairing. And of course, this production will affect consumption. We need to consume less new garments. Like we need to. This production is gonna, of course, affect this. This doesn't mean that we have to go around naked. I mean, there are enough clothes for everybody here. We have produced really a lot of clothes, and we can dress all the world with the clothes that we have produced, and also the next generation. However, this policy brief, this shifting cannot happen from one day to another. It needs to be just, so it needs to be focused on the workers, focused on the people that work in the global south, and also the people that work in the global north. It cannot happen from one day to another, but it needs to be not even super slow, because we have a rush on what climate change is doing to our planet. So I'm not going too detailed because here we don't have the author with us, So I'm gonna move it to the Q&A section. So again, if you want, you can you can scan with your phone the QR code, and we're gonna check now the question here. Okay, here's the first question that we have. Any data set to include gender too? I don't know, I feel like it's more for Morena, this question, if you have any answer to that.
Yes, sure. Excirebase includes data on gender. So the database that we use has data on gender. That means that the data that we presented could be disaggregated by gender. And this data is based on the ILO data, so the International Labor data. But just remember that, this was a lot of data as it was. So every time we disaggregate it into something else, we produce an extra amount of data. So the data that we produced was already a lot of data to be analyzed. And that's why we can't look at all the different lenses in one report. I think if we were to disaggregate this data by gender, that would have to be a whole report on its own, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you very much, Morena. So how are the fossil fuel calculation done? When is full report available? The full report is available right now in the website. Now we're gonna also put the link in the chat, so you can check it out there. So you can see it there, and then I pass it again to Morena.
Sure. So the way that the fossil fuel calculations are done, remember I showed that table of the input table if you were here then. So we basically trace throughout the supply chain all the resources that we identify as fossil fuels. So even the fossil fuel category could be disaggregated into many different types of fossil fuels, for example. But then we aggregate them on the fossil fuels, and then we trace them throughout the supply chain. All the way to the final consumer. And that is basically what we do with all the other resources as well. So that's what we do with water, what we do with land, minerals, metals, and also labor. I don't know if that is clear, but I think in the report, we have a section that details a little bit more the methodology if you're interested.
Thank you very much, Morena. Are human labor stats, one second here, I cannot read. Are human labor stats based on manufacturing or raw material production or both?
Okay, I guess it's me again. So they are based on both. We basically aggregate, as I showed in that little example of the supply chain, we are looking at everything that is going into the production of that product. So we are considering the labor that goes into the production of the raw material. We're considering the labor that is also going into the manufacturing, and that we can actually also disaggregate. So we could see that labor, how it's being used by different sectors all the way through to the final consumer. But again, more disaggregation, more data, more analysis. So if we look at everything, this report will have 100,000 pages. But yeah, so the labor basically includes all of that.
Thank you. How do you break global tax, trade, debt structure? The policy brief talk much more about consumption, retail side. Yeah, I think it's more a question directed to us. I mean, sorry, my mic went down. I'm not gonna go too much in detail because I feel like the author is not here. However, I think if you want to give any question, we're gonna pass here to Marula all the emails and all the things, so she can directly answer to those questions.
I'd be happy to come in a little bit as well on because yes, how do you break global tax trade debt structures? I mean, it's big, isn't it? It feels quite huge, and I think one of the actual real challenges for so many people and organizations that really want to see fashion changed is how do you bridge both this big systemic picture and what do you do today, tomorrow, in the here and now? So I think I would answer this a little bit by saying in the report we talk about, for example, a UN tax convention is a starting point. I'm not saying, oh, a UN tax convention, that's the answer, but it is about how is a different place for where tax issues globally can maybe sit and where there's control over those. Trade, a lot of it is about our countries and us as populations having democratic oversight over what our representatives do in terms of trade. There's also mechanisms such as the investor state dispute kind of mechanisms. There are sometimes quite niche policy areas within all of these. And others, for example, around debt. I mean, debt justice as a UK and also as a global movement does a lot around very specific policy pathways that would both be about the cancellation of debt, but also how we stop debt reaccumulating. Because one of the mechanisms here is the report puts down is that a lot of producing countries are generating debt because of this system of, well, you export the raw materials and the cheap labor, then with that money you can buy in the fuel or the food or the medicines that we're producing. So there's a real that those are also areas that continue to the cycle of debt. What I think is helpful to see in both of the reports, Extraction Fashion and the one from Research and Degrowth, is that there are multiple ways of attacking this problem, the big systemic one and the long term. So long term, I think we do have to think about, what is the big threads that are holding this together. But yes, it is also everything about transparency, everything that is trying to bring greater corporate control. Those are really important measures in the here and now. One hasn't tended to tackle quite so much the consumer side. So this is why there was a balance in the relationship in producing this, so that there was both of those aspects kind of covered. But and obviously people here will probably have more to say on some of the specifics. There's a whole depth around each of these. This is really a report that's starting the conversation. Let's miss the big picture, but don't let the big picture stop us taking immediate steps.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Thank you for coming in. Does your data also include end of life cycle, the textile waste that tends to be exported to global south countries as well? Maureen, I think also this is for you.
It doesn't, but it could. It is possible to calculate this, but it's not what we are looking at in this report. I don't know if that answers.
Yeah, thank you, Marina. Yes, of course, we cannot look at everything. Dear Marina, I was wondering why you used Exubase and not Gloria or Eora for your analysis. Are Exubase data better?
Sure. So I usually say that each database has its pros and cons. So it really depends on what you want to look at. Some of them will be better for answering some research questions and others will work better for answering other research questions. So basically, Eora has kind of been updated by Gloria. So I don't think a lot of people use Eora anymore. If they were to use Eora, they would now use Gloria. And in our case, Exubase was better because it has more environmental extensions, like the environmental extensions of Exubase are better than those of Eora. They are very extensive and very good. So that's why, because we were looking at so many environmental natural resources, it made sense for us to look at to work with Exubase. Also because Exubase has data on wage, so compensation for labor. And even though we didn't look at this in this report, it was something that we talked about and we considered at some point. So I wanted to make sure that this would still be a possibility if we wanted to expand. And if we had used Gloria, then we wouldn't be able to work with wage at some point. So those are the two main reasons.
Okay, here there is another question. Is there a role for private companies in future innovating with the new materials? Example, biofibers from farming on peatland, or the big fashion brands who have so much power? I think this is another question more for our policy brief. We don't go into detailed about technologies or biofibers, I think, in our policy brief. Mainly, we concentrate more in reducing the output and also on repairing stuff. And also, actually, we are concentrating a lot on big fashion and fast fashion and on how to reduce their production and therefore creating more locally based production. I don't know if Tansy or Ruth, we would like to chip in or say something.
Yeah, I can talk a bit about that. I think what the data, what the report that we worked on shows is that we can't afford for the plan to just be kind of continuing business as usual. The fashion industry has been like designed by big fashion brands. The exploitation of people and planet is what is rewarded within the fashion industry, and I think we just fundamentally want different things. The shareholders of big fashion brands, whether it's Nike or LVMH or Primark or Next or H&M, they want fundamentally different things. They want everything to continue as usual. I mean, I think some of the new materials that are being developed are some of the most exciting things happening within the fashion industry. So things like like mushroom leather and Pinatex and so on. And so I think the small like startups and small brands and enterprises that are using these things and who are showing that we can have fashion without massive environmental destruction are really important. So I think, yes, there's a role for them, and yes, there's a lot of role for innovation. But I don't believe there's a role for big fashion brands in a rebuilt industry. I think they are the problem along with capitalism, and I think we can't afford to take them with us into the future.
Thank you very much. We're going with the next question. To what extent is inner transformation healing a necessary part of fixing fashion? If so, how do you go about that at scale?
I mean, I've written a lot about this. I mean, so the fashion industry works on two like sort of pillars. So the first is like promise. It's the promise that that buying more fashion, more clothes, more makeup will make your life better, that it will sort of heal you. And then the second pillar from fashion is the threat. It's the carrot and the stick. So that the threat is that like you'll be unlovable, you won't keep up with society, you won't get a job, you won't get a partner, you won't get accommodation. So there is a lot of work that we need to do to heal ourselves from that, and to let go of all the messaging that the multi-billion-dollar messaging that fashion inflicts upon us, and letting go of a lot of like the guilt around why people buy clothing, and also like healing ourselves as a society. My ultimate thing when it comes to how do we change consumption? If you want to change consumption, you have to have a fundamentally different society, like a society that doesn't feel empty and lonely and alienating, but where value is more about not how people look, and there's more like leisure activities and community and stuff. So I mean, I think there is a lot of work to be done, and that's why I think fashion is interesting, because it acts as a lens for how we can start to change stuff. But yeah, building a fundamentally different society that doesn't threaten people, that it will leave them behind if they don't keep up with fashion, is incredibly incredibly important. And of course, allowing people to have the resources that they need in order to make the healthiest fashion choices or clothing choices that they can, which most people just don't have at the moment. I don't know if Ruth wants to add anything to that.
Yeah, I wanted to ask the same thing.
I know there's a few other questions, so we can maybe move on, but I think one thing, and it speaks to what you said, Tansy, is about that is part of that transformation is understanding ourselves as human beings, not as consumers, and rediscovering that, humanity. And also that's part of bridging our struggles as well, that it's not the opposition of consumers and producers and workers, but that I think that is key. And yeah, you mentioned it, there's literally billions of money spent selling us stuff that we don't need. So all avenues on addressing that as a human issue, a psychological issue, as well as an economic and political one, are important.
Thank you very much. We're going to the next question. Are human labor stats based on, no, this one, we already done it.
I'm just going to say in the gap, because I just saw that question about how do we make like everybody be able to afford like ethical fashion and stuff. I mean, like, and this is where domestic policy comes in, like ending austerity, ending unemployment, having things like universal basic income, so that there is a level playing field. Like, the sad thing is that, like, ethical fashion is a luxury at the moment that most people just can't afford. Being able to save is a condition of class. Putting everybody in the position where they can save would be really good. So yeah, changing our national policies would be a very massive part of like changing the fashion industry.
Just to pick up, I think there was a question a little earlier about who covers this cost. It might have been the same one that Tansy you picked up on. So one unescapable thing from this is if all the clothing that the UK, the EU wears was produced from the materials and the human hands within that area, it will be unaffordable for like pretty much that. So there is something around how do we tackle the inequality that is about making things equitable, the equity of it. So who pays? An answer to that is that in terms of things like addressing this, it is around the redistribution of wealth. And that goes along with changing some of those power structures. So we are looking at, it should be polluters that pay, some of the comments that people, would be familiar with. It's also about the fact that some of the tax that's obviously, with Morena said, all that profit gets accumulated by that final country. So producing countries don't receive that wealth. So mechanisms that bring that back are also about who pays is part of answering that question. It's how that wealth is redistributed is my short and rather clumsy response to that.
Okay, thank you very much. We are reaching the end of the event. I don't know if Tansy, Morena, or Ruth, you have any final remarks you would like to say about the report?
No, just that this data is a resource for people, and I hope people will use it in their campaigns and their research and their work. that would be a great outcome.
Yeah, and I would also like to say for, the work that Morena did on this was really, when we first saw some of this data, we were like, wow, because there is so much data around about fashion. But I think one thing that's really important in thinking about policy pathways in particular, having credible data is very important to being able to think of the implications of what's done. So that kind of just transition is it's supported by more credible data. So I just wanted to say and encourage people also to look at that and ways that we resource more of getting that credible data in the future.
I just want to say real quickly that I'm going to leave my email in the chat if anyone has more questions on the data, because I know it's quite complicated and we didn't have a lot of time here, so I couldn't go into a lot of detail. So if you're left with any question on the data, I will leave my email here.
Thank you very much to everybody. Thank you very much to War1, to Ruth, to Tansi, and to Morena to develop this amazing report. It was a long journey. We finally made it. I'm really glad to see it. Yes, you can find the report, the policy brief on our website. Also, there you're gonna have emails that you can contact to. So don't hesitate to write to us if you have any questions. And yeah, thank you very much. And I'm gonna close this event. Thank you to everybody.
Thank you.